The nurse let the rich woman into the morgue to say goodbye to her husband. And hearing what the foreigner was whispering, she pretended not to understand. Getting off the bus, Mary quickened her pace. The fine rain had already started to fall. Judging by the large puddles, it had been raining since last night. Otherwise, where could these miniature lakes come from? It was only a short distance to the city morgue when a passing reckless driver splashed into a puddle, splattering her from head to toe with dirty water. He didn't even attempt to brake, speeding off towards the city center. Mary felt like a wet hen. And why did she wear light clothes today? Her coffee-colored blouse was immediately covered in small dirty spots, and the light blue trousers, for which she had been saving up bit by bit from each paycheck, looked as if she had been in a swamp. Well, what's the use of talking about it? Wiping her face and part of her clothes with a damp tissue, Mary made her way to work. Well, how else, when Director Mr. Austin couldn't stand tardiness? He had been appointed to this position quite recently. So, he had to impress whoever necessary. Fortunately, today she wasn't late and arrived on time. But as soon as she crossed the threshold of the morgue, the coroner, Mr. Bryant, immediately approached her. "Anderson, why are you so late? You usually come in 10 minutes early. Anyway, let's go, change and prepare the body for release." A businessman was brought in tonight. Seems like he flew in from overseas to us. Wanted to start a business, but his heart couldn't take it. "And what about the autopsy, reports, medical certificates?" Mary asked in surprise. Mr. Bryant looked at the nurse with annoyance. "Anderson, don't try to confuse me, okay? I've already done everything, signed the necessary papers. Let's not drag it out. The deceased's wife will be here to pick up the body in an hour. Her flight was early in the morning. She's going straight to her husband. The body will be taken to the crematorium, and the urn with the ashes will be sent later." "Okay, Mr. Bryant. I'll do everything, don't worry," said Mary, realizing that it was not worth arguing with the coroner. After all, he's her boss. If he says do it this way, then we do it and don't ask unnecessary questions. The job of a nurse is never easy. All day long, you're like a squirrel in a wheel. After changing into her uniform, she hurried to the room where the release of the deceased's bodies to relatives took place. In fact, all the heavy lifting was done by male orderlies. And for Mary, there were subtleties to make sure that the clothes, and even the body itself, were in order. Maybe she would even have to apply makeup somewhere, depending on the condition of the body at the time of release. Entering the room, Mary saw a massive lacquered coffin with carved handles on both sides. The lid was open, so she could see the deceased. However, nothing special. Around 50 years old, slender, with gray at the temples. But the features of his face revealed him as a former resident of our country, and Mary determined this unmistakably. At that moment, she heard footsteps behind her. Has the relative already arrived? Oh, how awkward it turned out. But when Mary turned around, she saw behind her the young coroner Oliver. However, he was only on probation and could only assist Mr. Bryant. "Hi, Mary. Did I scare you?" "Hi, Ollie." "No, not at all. Whoever works in the morgue doesn't fear footsteps behind them," the nurse replied ironically. Yeah. It's a strange thing, after all," continued the conversation the coroner. "What's so strange about it? The man doesn't seem young. Must be a heart attack or stroke," she was surprised. Oliver shook his head. "I don't even know how to put it better, Mary. In fact, the autopsy wasn't conducted, and Mr. Bryant and I were practically forced to sign. Heart attack, the most common formulation." "Wow. And who made you sign the papers?" Mary persisted. "Well, who do you think? You're just like a child." "Of course, it was Mr. Austin." "Who else?" Oliver replied, barely containing his excitement, then quickly added, "Okay, I've chatted enough. I'll go, there's a lot of work today. This morning, some homeless guy turned up. At least it didn't involve any crime. Mary nodded and got down to business. Time was indeed pressing. However, the body was in pretty good condition, no bruises or scratches on the skin. The suit also looked like it fit perfectly. Apparently, the night shift orderly had made an effort. He had put on the suit and even worked on the appearance. Usually, you couldn't count on help from Mary, but look how caring he became. After a cursory glance at the body, Mary nodded in satisfaction and stepped aside. Essentially, she didn't have to do anything. It hadn't been like this in a long time, of course. Lucky, no doubt. At that moment, the door behind her swung open, and a woman entered the room wearing an elegant light yellow coat and holding a red folded umbrella. Mary froze in place out of surprise. This blonde woman looked so strikingly, it was easy to recognize her as a foreigner. "Where's my Albert? And why is the coffin in such an inconvenient place? I need to take a couple of photos for my husband's business partner's report," the guest began to complain instead of greeting. Her speech had a barely noticeable accent typical of foreigners. Mary shrugged uncertainly. "Well, what can we do? We don't have another place to put the coffin. Would you like me to turn on additional lighting?" "Oh yes, please, dear, your place is so dark, like a cellar." Mary nodded and approached the switch. Soon, the room was filled with bright light from powerful halogen lamps overhead. The stranger grimaced and, adjusting her venomously yellow coat, approached the coffin closely. To avoid interfering, Mary was about to leave the room when she heard a very strange phrase from the client, spoken in a language Mary knew relatively well. Out of surprise, the nurse froze at the door like a statue. And it wasn't because the foreigner switched to her native language, not at all. The point was different, the meaning of the uttered phrase itself. "Oh my God, no, this simply can't be. It's just my imagination," echoed in Mary's mind. But what the deceased Albert's wife said completely shocked her. The words spoken by the foreign guest spun in her mind like a stuck film. "Well, darling, thought you could outsmart me? Wanted to deprive me of the will and inheritance, didn't you? I know everything about you, my dear. Did you like the new medications? I see you did. Are you sleeping now? So tight that you'll never wake up again." Saying this, the woman barely suppressed a malicious laugh and began to photograph the body and the coffin from different angles. Mary knew that in this way, the foreigner intended to capture the body before it was sent to the crematorium. So to speak, for memory. In principle, it wasn't such a rare occurrence. But why did this pretentious lady address the deceased in such a mocking tone? And what did she mean at all? Mary was about to leave the room when she heard a frantic female scream behind her. The nurse turned around and saw that the visitor had pressed herself against the wall and was looking at the deceased in horror. "His fingers are trembling. Do you see it? Is he alive?" Mary frowned. "No, that can't be. You must have imagined it." The foreigner's face turned as white as chalk. "Do I look like a fool to you? Go and see what's there." "Well, why are you standing there like a statue?" Mary approached the coffin on shaky legs and almost fainted at what she saw. The businessman's wife was right. The wealthy man was indeed alive, as evidenced by the characteristic contraction of the facial muscles around the eyes and lower lip. Understanding that she couldn't delay, Mary immediately ran to the phone to call the resuscitation team. Fortunately, the resuscitation department was adjacent to the city morgue, which significantly facilitated the task for the young orderly. What happened next seemed more like a dream than harsh reality. Mary stood there, unable to believe her eyes, as everyone rushed around, bustling about. At some point, the orderly lost sight of the resurrected businessman's wife, and when she came to her senses, the foreigner was nowhere to be found. However, Mary didn't really need any interaction with this quarrelsome individual right now. It's not every day you witness a resurrection from the dead, and certainly not in plain sight without a hint of mysticism from the TV screen. At some point, Mr. Bryant approached her and discreetly asked, "Anderson, did that visitor happen to tell you anything? You know, maybe just in passing?" Mary shrugged uncertainly. "Well, I don't think so. What could she have said? The pathologist noticeably became nervous and looked around warily. Well, you never know what's on the minds of these rich folks. They could sue us for anything. As soon as something happens, they rush to their lawyers and straight to court. And then I'll have to pay for moral damages for the rest of my life. Mary shook her head doubtfully. I don't think so. And what about you, Mr. Bryant? Me? Well, I didn't perform the autopsy on Mr. Austin's orders, so he wouldn't be left out. He's fine. Washed his hands of it all. And what about me? I'm left holding the bag, no matter how you slice it. My signature's on the papers, and so is Ollie's. We've really gotten ourselves into a mess. Not even for a pound of raisins. Look, they might even ruin my career, the pathologist said with regret, and then headed to the autopsy room, where police officers were already waiting for him to give testimony. Mary breathed a sigh of relief and decided to approach the window to get some fresh air. Opening the blind slightly, she froze. Behind her, some guy in a dark blue jacket and sneakers of a darker color was watching her intently. Seeing Mary, he immediately seemed embarrassed and lazily made his way to a nearby bench. Who was he? A relative of the deceased? A curious onlooker? But where could she have seen him before? It was just recently. Mary pondered, mentally replaying the events of the recent days and hours. Since everyone was too busy to pay attention to her now, the young orderly could vividly recall every detail of today. She got up at dawn out of habit. It's not that she didn't want to sleep, it's just that she had to prepare breakfast for the twins, Larry and Jimmy, and also help her mom take her medications, explain everything, and show her. At first glance, it didn't seem too difficult, but when you have to do this every morning, it becomes routine. Mom, will you buy us ice cream today, just in a cup? The early rising Jimmy quietly asked his brother Larry. Mary smiled. Of course, I will. Just be careful, or you might get a sore throat. It won't hurt, Mom. We'll be careful. We'll wait for it to thaw a bit, added Larry, who had also woken up. Mary lovingly looked at her sons, then got ready for work. Her mom was already awake and had taken her medications. Mary also gave her a pain-relieving injection to ease the pain in her back. About half a year ago, Anna slipped on the ice and fell onto the icy pavement. As luck would have it, that day was when freezing rain poured down, a downpour so severe that not even the municipal road service's de-icing agents could cope. Of course, Anna blamed no one. Who could she blame when the forces of nature wreaked havoc on the city? Unfortunately, the injury didn't leave the elderly woman unscathed. It's understandable, at her age, health problems are abundant. Don't worry, dear, we'll get through this ordeal. And thank you for saving me from becoming a Zach's invalid. There was a real threat, Anna tried to encourage herself. Kissing her mom goodbye, Mary waved to the twins and headed to work. It was gloomy outside, with a palpable dampness in the air. I should have grabbed an umbrella, or I'll end up caught in the rain, Mary thought on her way to the bus stop. There was an unusually large crowd during rush hour today, school children, factory workers, and office employees. There were hardly any free seats, but Mary got lucky. Taking a window seat, she leaned against the side wall and blissfully closed her eyes. She always did that to pass the time and catch a little nap on the way. However, she couldn't fall asleep today. The bus was quite noisy, and lightning flashes outside were followed by rolls of thunder. Realizing she couldn't sleep, Mary took out a pocket-sized book from her bag and started reading. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about it. People read books all the time, what's so strange? Well, this book was in a foreign language, and Mary was indeed reading it, not just looking at the pictures. Seeing this, her bus neighbor asked in surprise, "Are you reading in a foreign language?" Mary tore her gaze from the book and replied embarrassedly, "Yeah, I've been into translations since school." The stranger nodded respectfully. "You're smart. My Freddie, my son, didn't want to study, got mixed up with a bad crowd. Now I'm collecting parcels for him in prison. And you must be a teacher, right? When Mary mentioned her job, she hesitated and tried to change the subject, but the curious neighbor couldn't be stopped. Which school do you teach at? My friend's grandson is weak in foreign languages. Needs a tutor. Will you take him on? The pay's good, won't hurt the family budget. Mary shook her head no. No, I'm not a teacher. I'm more involved with medicine. Medicine? That explains it. It's a noble profession, the neighbor said with marked respect. Mary deliberately avoided mentioning where she actually worked. How could she say she worked as a sanitation worker in the city morgue? The job was quite specific, to say the least. Mary had long been accustomed to people reacting strongly to the intricacies of her profession. The mystery of death, daily interactions with the deceased's relatives, and the specific smell of disinfectants, which initially made her feel nauseous. However, Mary herself didn't consider her job special and treated it as something mundane and unremarkable. Seeing her stop approaching, she was about to get off when she came face to face in the aisle with a very strange guy. The stranger was wearing that same blue windbreaker and dark sneakers that for some reason stuck in her memory. There was nothing particularly unusual about the guy's appearance, except that he decided to get off at the same stop as her. From experience, Mary knew that few people got off here because the city morgue was nearby. Usually, everyone tried to get off at the previous stop to reach the hospital courtyard from the main entrance. Shrugging, Mary cautiously passed by the guy and headed towards the exit. Naturally, the stranger followed her. She felt his intense gaze on her for some inexplicable reason. What does he want from me? Is he in love? No, doesn't seem like it. He doesn't look like he wants to flirt with me. Then what does he want? Mary pondered until a passing car splashed mud on her. In that instant, thoughts of the guy in the blue windbreaker vanished as if they had never existed, only to return now as Mary saw him again from the window of the city morgue. I wonder why he's here. Maybe he needs something? Or perhaps he's following me? No, unlikely. Why would someone track a lonely mother of two, the sanitation workers thought ironically. At that moment, she heard stealthy footsteps behind her. Turning around, she saw Mr. Austin, the director. Mary, there's something. Maybe Mr. Bryant already told you, but don't talk too much to the police, okay? Just say it's my small business, did what they said. They handed over the body, and the deceased turned out to be alive. Mary raised an eyebrow in surprise. I don't care. And what else could I say? I really did my job, the one I was assigned. Didn't I? I followed the instructions, it can be easily verified. Mentioning the instructions noticeably made the director nervous. Okay, I got it. In general, watch what you say, okay? And don't say anything extra. And if everything goes as needed, a bonus. And I'll add a couple more days off to your vacation, so to speak, on the house. Mary nodded awkwardly, not wanting to prolong this unpleasant conversation. Deep down, she was shocked by the boss's proposal. Why hide something that can be easily verified, she thought. Throughout the day, policemen and some unfamiliar people with video cameras and miniature recorders flitted back and forth in the morgue building, attaching them to those they interviewed. I hope at least I'll be spared from this fate, Mary remarked ironically, continuing her mundane work of disinfecting premises and sterilizing tools. But when one of the reporters approached her closely and thrust a microphone towards her, Mary realized she couldn't avoid it anymore. What can you say about this? After all, people don't return from the other side every day in your morgue, the man asked with a smooth voice. Mary hesitated for a moment, as she had no experience speaking on camera. Excuse me, but I really don't know what to say. Probably there was a medical error or something like that. I just did my job and witnessed a man waking up, Mary replied, stumbling over each word. The reporter frowned displeased. Frankly, he had hoped that he could get this sanitation worker to talk, hoping she would blurt out something extra that would significantly boost the ratings of the television news broadcast. But to his huge disappointment, Mary turned out to be taciturn, and on top of that, she constantly seemed afraid and watchful. Thanking the sanitation worker, the reporter stepped outside and headed to his car. Essentially, his job was done. He had interviewed everyone he could, and now he had to edit and release the recording. As for Mary, after the conversation with the reporter, she felt uncomfortable. A nasty shiver ran down her spine, and her forehead was covered in sticky sweat. After all, something strange, incomprehensible, and extraordinary had happened in the morgue. How did this man return from the dead? And why wasn't there an autopsy performed? And what did that foreign woman mean who disappeared in the most inexplicable way? Mary tried to mentally recall the words she heard from the deceased's spouse. That's when she remembered that the guest mentioned some medications. Perhaps these medications were the cause of his apparent death. Although pharmacology has advanced these days, who knows what this wealthy man could have taken to end up on the other side, Mary thought, trying not to dwell on this unpleasant topic. The rest of the day passed relatively calmly for her. Mr. Bryant and Mr. Austin locked themselves in the office and argued loudly about something. Oliver, having nothing to do, sat in the lobby watching the news broadcast with the security guard. Spotting Mary, the intern immediately called her over. "Look, Mary, you're on TV." She smiled shyly. "Oh, I look like a monster. How can they interview someone unprepared like that? They could have at least given me a mirror." "Oh, come on, you're always beautiful," Oliver remarked with a smile. The sanitation worker blushed embarrassedly. The thing was, she had noticed for not the first time the intense gaze of the guy who clearly indicated he found her attractive. However, Mary remained calm, trying not to force things. Few knew that she had already experienced an unpleasant episode in her life related to such passionate relationships, which could flare up at the most unexpected moment. However, at that time, she was studying to be a surgeon at medical school, and perhaps would have become a doctor if it weren't for her friendship with Zach, who swept her off her feet and then left her pregnant with twins. Perhaps if Mary had known in advance that Zach would leave her, she would have found the strength to opt for an abortion, but Zach behaved calmly. At first, he was even happy to become a father, but after the future father had a thorough conversation with his parents, he radically changed his mind. Following his mother's advice, Zach immediately tried to distance himself from Mary and then transferred to another educational institution. Naturally, this matter did not go without the intervention of his influential father, Mr. Webb, who did everything possible to minimize his son's communication with a girl from a poor family. But Mary herself did not consider herself poor. She and her mother lived in a 2-room apartment, saving money for many years to buy it. Of course, without a trendy renovation, but it couldn't be called a hovel either. Anna, for as long as she could remember, worked as a schoolteacher and dreamed that her daughter would become a doctor. Unfortunately, the dream was never meant to come true. Throughout Mary's pregnancy, she felt unwell. She suffered from morning sickness and dizziness. Continuing her studies in such conditions was simply impossible. Initially, Mary took an academic leave, hoping that she would quickly recover and return to her studies. But when she found out from an ultrasound that she was expecting twins, she realized she needed to prepare for difficult childbirth. Unfortunately, the specialist's concerns proved to be correct, and Mary couldn't deliver the babies naturally. Despite the timely and proper performance of the cesarean section, she had to recover for a very long time. The reason for this was poor blood clotting, which had plagued Mary since birth. For several days, doctors fought for her life, doing almost the impossible. Throughout this period, Anna went to church every day and prayed for her daughter's health. It's hard to say whether anyone heard her prayer or not, but the fact that Mary slowly began to recover served as undeniable evidence in favor of the first assumption. Mary's life after leaving the clinic was predictably filled with challenges in raising her twins. Temporarily putting her university education on hold, the young mother kept postponing it, telling herself she could enroll next year and would definitely complete her studies. But time passed, the kids grew up, and Mary couldn't fulfill her plans. Eventually, she resigned herself to this and started looking for work. To help her daughter, Anna offered her a job as a librarian at a secondary school, but Mary declined. Deep down, she always felt an irresistible pull toward medicine and, while trying on a hospital gown in front of the mirror, imagined herself as a doctor whose reputation within the walls of the medical institution would be impeccable. Unfortunately, all of this remained just dreams. After some hesitation, Mary had to come to terms with harsh reality and take a job as a sanitation worker. At first, she worked in the surgical department, where she once dreamed of working after finishing university. Everything went well for a while until Mary clashed with the head of the department, who immediately recognized in the sanitation worker his undereducated former colleague. The cause of the conflict was a medical error that Mary pointed out to one of the doctors during a brief conversation. From the perspective of someone in a lower position, this was an unforgivable mistake, especially in the eyes of the head of the surgical department. So, when Mary was accused of criminal negligence that led to the disappearance of medication, it hardly surprised anyone. The young sanitation worker tried to prove her innocence, but the case was steadily moving towards a conclusion. Fortunately, thanks to her mother's connections, Mary managed to avoid criminal prosecution. One of her students happened to work in a law firm and thus provided the young sanitation worker with quality legal representation in court free of charge. Consequently, the charges against Mary collapsed like a house of cards. "I'm so glad, sweetheart. I couldn't find my place," Anna said tearfully at the time. Unfortunately, after everything that happened, Mary could no longer work in the surgical department. Her former colleagues looked at her with reproach, and the head of the department even dreamed of throwing her behind bars. That's when she transferred to the city morgue, where they hired anyone who could claim to have strong nerves. Naturally, the first time in her new position was very difficult. After all, Mary was a representative of the fairer sex. But here, the workload was heavy. Every day she had to deal with death in its various manifestations. Over time, Mary got used to it, stopped paying attention to it, considering it just a job, like that of an actor appearing in horror movies. He just wipes off the makeup and returns home to family and friends. The same goes for her. She took off her uniform, took a shower, and became a completely different person. She was treated quite decently in her new position. Her colleague Martin turned out to be an experienced sanitation worker who knew all the ins and outs of what was happening within the walls of the city morgue. Being a shrewd and far-sighted man, he knew how to take advantage of almost any situation. It was Martin who tried to instill in her the habit of charging visitors money for any service provided. But she thought differently, understanding perfectly well that the person had already suffered, losing a close relative. So why else should she take money from them when all the services were outlined in her job description? Despite the fact that today's shift dragged on like rubber, Mary still waited for its end. With joy, she left the dull building at the end of the day, breathing in the fresh spring air with delight. She looked up at the sky and saw the sun trying to break through in some places. Smiling, Mary remembered that the kids had asked her to buy them ice cream. "I wonder how they're doing. Haven't they tired out Grandma too much? After all, Mom also needs to rest, and I've left my children with her," the sanitation worker thought, hurrying to the bus stop. At that moment, out of the corner of her eye, she saw the distinct blue windbreaker, the guy who was once again following her as if he were an experienced hunter. Well, what else does he want from me? Or maybe he's some kind of lunatic or bandit. Well, all sorts of things happen in life, Mary thought anxiously and tried to break away from the pursuer by speeding up her pace. She literally ran into the approaching bus and immediately began to push her way through the disgruntled passengers. Meanwhile, the guy managed to jump onto the bus just a second before the doors closed. The driver grumbled discontentedly. "Where are you pushing? I won't take everyone anyway." "Hey, kid, get out of here, now." Mary glanced at the stranger out of the corner of her eye, but he pretended not to hear the remarks and calmly paid for his ride. She glanced at him and quickly looked away, intending to blend in with the rest of the passengers. The bus driver shook his head and started the engine. Trying to avoid the persistent pursuer, Mary walked to the back of the bus, where there happened to be an empty seat for her. In doing so, she overlooked the fact that she hadn't paid for her ride. Perhaps this happened to everyone who used public transportation at least once. And everything would have been fine, but today there was a ticket inspector on the route who decided to check the tickets of the passengers selectively. A woman in her 50s, who looked at Mary with an intent gaze, immediately singled her out from the crowd, choosing her as her target. She patiently waited for the bus to start moving, then got up from her seat and headed towards Mary to accuse her of not paying for her ride. "Well, citizens, show your tickets and pay for the ride. I warn you right away, rabbits won't be able to travel today," the ticket inspector said in a well-modulated voice. Mary flinched and automatically reached for her purse, where her wallet was. "Oh, where did it disappear to? Did it fall out when I was getting on the bus, or did someone steal it? Well, I bought ice cream for the kids." Tears welled up in her eyes as she saw the formidable figure of the ticket inspector in front of her. "So, are we going to look or are we done here? I told you right away, rabbits won't be able to travel today. So let's either pay for the ride or write up a fine. Although, I think, why waste time? Let's go straight to the protocol. I hope you have your ID with you." Mary's lips trembled betrayingly. "Yes, I have it with me, but my wallet was really stolen. It was there, I remember it clearly. I checked it with my hand when I was getting on the bus, and then..." The ticket inspector smiled contentedly. "Well, yes. And then you got distracted and decided to pretend that you didn't need to pay for the ride. You're all the same. Sometimes you get distracted, sometimes you start thinking, sometimes you fall asleep. Always the same excuses. I already know them by heart. So come on, honey, don't waste time, pay for the ride." A tear slowly rolled down Mary's cheek. "I'm sorry, but I have nothing to pay with." "Let's write up the fine," the sanitation worker whispered bitterly. The woman chuckled and reached into her pocket for her pen and notepad. At that moment, the guy in the blue windbreaker squeezed through to her and handed over some money. "Here, take it. It's enough for the ride and the fine, maybe even some change left for tea. Leave her alone, please." Still not believing her eyes, Mary looked at her savior and mentally thanked him for his help. She was momentarily speechless with surprise and couldn't say a word. "I thought this guy wanted to harm me," she thought. The ticket inspector looked ironically at the defender of the fair dodger. "Have you thought this through, kid? Look, the fair dodgers, are like that. They specially target the well-off so they can later extract money from them. For example, you've paid for the ride now, and what's next? Something else, and then in a year or two, you'll buy a flat for Mary." The guy's eyes showed that he would stand his ground. "Excuse me, do you take money? If not, I'll talk to your management. What's the problem here?" "Right, payment for the ride and the fine. Collect the fare, process everything properly, or I'll file a complaint." At the mere mention of a complaint, the ticket inspector instantly tensed up and her expression changed. At that moment, even Mary understood that the bus station employee didn't want any trouble and would likely accept the stranger's offer. It just so happened that after the guy in the blue windbreaker intervened, she didn't have a chance to say anything. Only when the inspector took the money from him did Mary quietly say, "Thank you so much. I'll definitely pay you back, every penny." But the guy smiled strangely, and then, to her surprise, he suddenly disappeared into the crowd of passengers, only to timely reappear at one of the stops. "What's with him? Did he get offended?" "No, doesn't seem like it. He looks like a normal guy." "Oh, why did I think so badly of him?" Mary whispered, still feeling the penetrating stares of the passengers. And a pleasant surprise awaited her at home. As soon as Mary opened the door, Larry and Jimmy rushed to greet her, shouting about recently watching a report with her in it. Mom, you're a real magician. You brought Uncle back from the dead." She smiled and shook her head shyly. "No, come on, I didn't do anything like that, and I didn't resurrect Uncle. He came back himself, woke up, if you will. It just so happened that I was nearby." Anna looked at her daughter with undisguised concern. "How are you feeling, Mary? Better now? When I saw this report, I immediately started worrying about you. You never know. You could have felt bad from all this. It's not the nicest place. Oh, God forbid, you dreamed of becoming a surgeon, and now you had to become a sanitation worker in the morgue." "No, Mom, everything's fine. Really, don't worry, everything's good. How about you? Is your back bothering you?" Anna waved her hand in annoyance. "Well, how to say? It bothers me, of course, but I endure it. The injection only works for half a day, and then my lower back hurts so much I can't walk. So I try to work in the kitchen while sitting. I sit on a stool and cook or knit." Mary bit her lip to keep from crying. She had brought up the question of surgery with her mom more than once. They even got in line for a quota, but for some reason, things stalled and hadn't budged for months. Of course, Mary could seek help from Jimmy and Larry's biological father, who now worked in the surgery department of a very well-known private clinic. But she couldn't bring herself to do it. She didn't want to. Not just out of pride, but because Zach had abandoned her, never acknowledging the children as his. When they met, he always looked away and pretended not to know her. In essence, Mary could prove his paternity by DNA test, but she didn't. She didn't want to humiliate herself, didn't want to look like a beggar in the eyes of her failed fiancé and his family. Sitting down at the table with her sons and her mom, Mary reluctantly ate dinner, poking at the salad with her fork. This was explained by a complete lack of appetite, as she was still thinking about the incident with the stranger who saved her on the bus. Who was he really? A mysterious admirer, a potential suitor, or just a passerby who happened to be nearby and decided to help her in a difficult situation? Mary didn't know the answer to that question. After checking her son's homework, she secluded herself in the kitchen with a book, trying to distract herself from unpleasant thoughts. Meanwhile, the patient who had regained consciousness in the morgue slowly came to his senses in the intensive care unit. Around Albert Bailey, there was a constant buzzing and ticking, as if he were on the bridge of an alien spaceship. It took the businessman a while to figure out exactly where he was. His head was spinning, and he was very thirsty. Seeing the doctor entering the room, Albert asked softly, "Tell me, what happened? Is it all because of my illness?" The intensivist frowned and ran his hand over the medical cap covering his head. "No, Albert, it's not so much about the illness as it is about the medications you took without consulting a doctor." The businessman gasped in surprise. "How is that without consultations? I always consulted with my doctor when he prescribed me these medications. And I bought them at the pharmacy, took them for some time, and then flew here to finish some business." The doctor looked carefully into the patient's eyes and realized that he was indeed telling the truth and sincerely didn't understand how medications of a completely different kind ended up in his pill containers. "Well, I don't know, Albert, it's up to you to decide, but if I were in your place, I would pay attention to the people closest to me. Maybe someone deliberately swapped the pills, or it was a fatal coincidence. Although the bottle and label on the medications found with you are true, the contents are completely different." "How different?" the businessman asked. "Well, these tablets in the condition of your illness induced a medicated coma in you, remotely resembling a lethargic sleep. It's extremely rare. Truth be told, I've encountered this for the first time, so I'm keeping an eye on your case to make notes for my future interns." Albert pondered. The head of the department's words honestly puzzled him. The businessman's thoughts smoothly flowed backward, returning him to the day when his wife Christina brought him a plastic bottle of medications before her flight. Albert had forgotten them in the hustle and bustle of preparing for the trip and only remembered when he opened the taxi door. Well, Christina couldn't have swapped them. Although, Considering how we parted ways and what an unpleasant conversation we had the day before, it's quite possible. Although no, it's all speculation, no facts, the businessman thought and wearily closed his eyes. Seeing that the patient was weakened and wanted to rest, the head of the department quietly left the room and closed the door behind him. But no sooner had Mr. Ford taken 10 steps than he immediately encountered a striking blonde who was dressed in a way that was impossible not to notice. The yellow coat and red umbrella in the hands of the stranger acted like bait designed for a lasting visual effect. "Excuse me, are you my husband's attending physician?" she asked without any transition. By the characteristic notes in the guest's voice, the doctor unmistakably recognized her as the foreign wife of the injured businessman. "Yes, it's me, Mr. Ford. What do you need?" Christina paused for a moment and, biting her lip, said, "Tell me, is my husband okay? He'll recover, won't he?" Mr. Ford shrugged, but then assured the guest that he saw no reason why he wouldn't recover. "Most likely, he'll be fine. Especially if your husband stops taking these medications." A thin, barely noticeable wrinkle immediately appeared on Christina's forehead. From her eyes, it was evident that she was clearly dissatisfied with the answer and wanted to hear something else. "Oh, I told Albert not to fly to this country. Something always happens here. As soon as he arrives, problems immediately start chasing him. One thing after another. And now this illness on top of everything else. Well, if I were you, I wouldn't be so categorical. The thing is, your husband's illness isn't fatal. It can't be considered a death sentence. With the right therapy and diet, people live with it for several years, even decades. So, I suggest talking to your husband and asking him to think about his own health. And even better, transfer the management of the business to someone else." Christina smiled, perhaps for the first time since the conversation began. "Exactly, you've hit the nail on the head. I told him the same thing, insisted that Albert transfer the business to me. But he left his will to some girl I've never heard of. Where did he find her? I have no idea. Maybe she's his mistress?" Mr. Ford frowned. "Well, I haven't seen anyone else here, but overall, this is your problem, of course. Sorry, I don't want to delve into the details of your husband's personal life. And anyway, I think things aren't so straightforward in this matter, you understand?" Christina nodded and, bidding goodbye curtly, left the intensive care unit. Frankly, she didn't like the conversation with Mr. Ford. In turn, the head of the department immediately understood this. Firstly, the fatal beauty showed no desire to visit her husband. And secondly, she behaved as if Albert were already dead. Sighing sadly, the doctor stood for a while in the corridor, then returned to his office to work on documents. Meanwhile, Mary had a rather restless night. For some inexplicable reason, she dreamt of the morgue, where each of the deceased went through what had happened today with Albert Bailey. And she couldn't shake off the words spoken by the deceased's wife, who, without mincing words, expressed her attitude towards what happened to her husband. Mary woke up in the morning feeling completely drained, and immediately caught herself thinking that perhaps she was coming down with a cold or even the flu. But then, after drinking coffee and perking up a bit, her confidence returned. "Mary, maybe you should stay home today? You look absolutely exhausted," her mother asked with concern. "No, Mom, I'll go. There's a lot of work today, you know, and there's no one to cover for me. There's always a shortage of orderlies in regular medical facilities, let alone in the morgue," Mary replied. Anna looked at her daughter lovingly, then gently patted her on the shoulder. "Still, be careful and take care of yourself. Your job is such that you could burn out in a year. You see so much pain and suffering." "It's okay, Mom, we'll get through it. Just keep an eye on Larry and Jimmy, okay? They're such rascals. I keep telling them not to tire Grandma out, but you know how it usually goes with them, in one ear and out the other." "All right, don't worry, I'll take care of everything," her mother said with a trembling voice as they said goodbye. But as soon as Mary left the house, she almost immediately saw her rescuer from yesterday across the street. The guy in the blue windbreaker was sitting on a bench, watching attentively what was happening on the opposite side of the street. Seeing Mary, he visibly became flustered, realizing he was caught off guard again. Determined to get to the bottom of it once and for all, Mary walked purposefully towards her pursuer and asked directly, "Why are you spying on me? What did I do to you? Don't tell me you're here by accident. I know everything. And about yesterday on the bus, too. Well, thank you, of course, for your help. Here, I want to give you back the money," Mary said, handing the stranger a few bills. The amount she handed him was slightly more than what was needed for the fare and the fine, but the stranger simply shook his head in refusal. No, you don't need to give me any money. Really, it was no trouble at all to help you. So why are you following me? What did I do to you?" Mary's insistence cornered the stranger. Taking a deep breath, he began his story. "My name is Jason," the guy introduced himself. "About a month ago, a man named Albert Bailey hired me." "Did you say Albert Bailey?" Mary asked. The detective nodded affirmatively. "Yes, the same Bailey who resurrected in the morgue yesterday. You've probably heard about it?" She smiled. "Not only heard, but also witnessed it firsthand. It was during my shift that he regained consciousness, after his wife tried to send his body to the crematorium." Jason sighed sadly. "Anyway, Mary, I won't beat around the bush. Albert hired me to find you, give your approximate name and surname, as well as the coordinates and address of the orphanage where you were raised until about 18 months old." Mary's eyebrows raised smoothly. "What orphanage are you talking about? What do you mean?" "I actually have a mother." Jason smiled. "Please, hear me out until the end, and then everything will become clear. You see, you're not your mother's biological daughter. Being childless, Anna adopted you at a very young age." "No, you're kidding. That's nonsense. I don't believe you, hear me? Tell me, where did you get this from?" Mary exclaimed challengingly. Jason shook his head. "Well, to believe it or not is your right, but I would advise you to start by talking to your mother. I'm sure she'll confirm my words. Your real parents were Albert Bailey and his wife Hope. However, she died during childbirth, and Albert had to leave the country urgently as he had legal and competitor problems at the time. It was a chaotic time back then. Many suffered or disappeared without a trace. And after your mother's death, you ended up in a nursery first, and then in an orphanage. Of course, you don't remember this, but Anna can definitely tell you about it." Tears welled up in Mary's eyes. The thought echoed in her mind with startling clarity, but maybe the guy is lying? Surely he made it up to deceive or disorient me. But for what purpose? Why? She didn't know the answer to that question. Meanwhile, Jason continued. "Christina, well, the one who was in the morgue, isn't your mother or relative. From what I observed, she found out in advance that Albert decided to leave you the entire inheritance. But why would I need his inheritance? Is he sick or something?" Mary exclaimed, still not believing what her interlocutor was saying. He smirked. "He's sick, but not fatally. Doctors said there's a good chance of recovery, but his wife thinks otherwise." All this only became clear now when I analyzed the situation and put two and two together. Besides Christina, no one else could have an interest in Albert's demise. "Why have you been following me all this time?" Mary asked more peacefully. Jason looked down sheepishly. "I was worried that Christina might get to you. She could have hired someone to help her. Anyway, I'm sorry I didn't tell you right away. And now I suggest we go see your father. He's been in the intensive care unit since yesterday." Mary's cheeks turned crimson with excitement. "How's that? Just like that, we're going? But I need to go to work. Or do you want me to get fired from here?" Jason smiled. "No, they won't fire you. Your boss, by the way, turned out to be knee-deep in all this mess. It was he and the senior pathologist who arranged with Christina that there would be no autopsy. Apparently, they were afraid that the analysis would reveal the same drug in the blood that Albert's wife slipped into his pills. Still unsure of what to do, Mary, after brief contemplation, decided to accept Jason's offer, who at that moment seemed like a real wizard to her. As it turned out later, the detective didn't deceive her and told her everything as it was. And when Mary asked for a day off, Mr. Austin readily agreed. "Yes, of course, Mary. Take a day or two off, rest. You've been through so much yesterday. And I'll call Martin to cover for you, so don't worry, we'll manage, it's not the first time." Only after this did Mary fully realize that Jason was telling the truth from beginning to end. When she entered Albert's room with the detective, her heart was racing like crazy. She had never experienced anything like this before. Could this pale, hunched-over man really be her father? Hearing footsteps, the businessman opened his eyes and saw before him a young woman with kind gray eyes and a sweet smile on her slightly plump, sensual lips. His face immediately lit up with a smile. "Well, hello, my dear daughter. I'm glad you finally found me." Mary coughed shyly, then remarked, "It's not me who found you, but the detective you hired. Jason told me everything, but I have only one question. Are you really sure that I'm your daughter?" Albert smiled. "I am sure. I interviewed everyone who delivered my wife's baby over 25 years ago. They confirmed it. The baby girl born was named Mary. True, your adoptive mother, Anna, changed your surname to Anderson later on, but that was her decision. Of course, I have no complaints against her, but I would still be glad if you ever changed your surname to Bailey." Mary shook her head. "No, Albert, I'm sorry, but I won't change my surname. And besides, I believe that parents are not those who give birth, but those who raise." Albert nodded in agreement, then asked her to come closer. "You know, you have the same eyes that my Hope had back then. And Christina. Christina is different. She just bewitched me, a passing passion. And I never had any real love for her, so I left the inheritance to you as soon as Jason found your trail." At that moment, the detective standing nearby coughed awkwardly, then added, "Albert, I think you should know that Christina wanted to poison you by substituting the medicine in the vial for another one that causes cardiac arrest or a medicated coma. It's harmless to ordinary people, but in your condition, it could have been a real poison, which, actually, happened upon arrival in the country. Christina knew everything and deliberately followed you to poison you and leave herself the inheritance." Albert clenched his jaw in pain, then patted Mary on the shoulder. "Okay, I'll deal with this. Now that my daughter is here, I'll never feel lonely and abandoned by everyone again." A few minutes later, the businessman was asleep again, plunged into a troubled and painful sleep. Mary, however, didn't sit idly by and, together with Jason, went to her mother and laid out the truth as she learned it from Albert. Looking at her adoptive daughter, Anna cried, and then, without saying a word, hugged her by the shoulders. In such moments, even words seem unnecessary. On the same day, Christina Bailey was detained at the airport, where she intended to fly to one of the Asian countries. The very drug she had been slipping to her husband at the moment of his departure to his homeland was found in her possession. Faced with irrefutable evidence, Christina immediately confessed, shocking even the seasoned operatives. Greed and the fear that Albert would leave his inheritance to his newly found daughter were to blame for it all. Only a week after the miraculous resurrection in the morgue, Albert learned how incredibly lucky he had been. Christina had made a mistake and acquired a drug slightly less potent than the situation demanded. Meanwhile, Mary visited her father almost every day, spending hours in his room. Mr. Ford didn't resist. On the contrary, he welcomed it, saying that such kindness from his daughter positively influenced the patient's recovery dynamics. Albert stayed in the clinic for about 2 weeks before finally being discharged in good health. He decided not to return abroad, but instead chose to stay with his daughter to open a small clinic to treat people with the ailment he himself suffered from. Mary resigned from the morgue and planned to work in her father's clinic as either a nurse or an operating room assistant. During this time, she became very close to Jason, whom she now without exaggeration considered her guardian angel. In fact, it was true, as the detective fell in love with Mary at first sight the day he saw her on the street. Learning that Jason was planning to propose to his daughter, Albert patted the young man on the shoulder and congratulated him on soon becoming his son-in-law. But the happiest of all was Anna, who finally witnessed the moment when her daughter bound her life to a real man with a capital M, unlike her first choice, Zach, who abandoned her and the children to fate. Mary invited all her friends and acquaintances to the wedding, and they gladly joined the celebration, surprising many in the town. Larry and Jimmy, the twins, rejoiced along with everyone else, dancing and laughing.